These 6 individuals made decisions involving food that would cost them their lives. From contaminated dishes to misidentified ingredients, these are the stories of people whose final meals became their last. It was July 4th, 2015, in sweltering Des Moines. As families arrived with covered dishes and coolers for a 4th of July potluck, unaware heat was setting stage for tragedy. Patricia Brennan adjusted the plastic wrap covering her famous potato salad one final time, the same recipe that had won first place at 3 consecutive summer gatherings. At 67, the retired elementary school teacher had spent 34 years teaching 3rd grade, and now devoted her time to community volunteer work and her award-winning garden that supplied ingredients for her popular potluck contributions. Patricia had woken at 6 a.m. to prepare the potato salad, boiling 12 pounds of russet potatoes and mixing them with her secret combination of mayonnaise, hard-boiled eggs, celery, and seasonings that neighbors had been trying to replicate for years. Her air conditioning had stopped working the previous evening, and with the holiday weekend, no repair technician could come until Tuesday. The temperature inside her kitchen had climbed to 82 degrees by 8 a.m., but Patricia was accustomed to working in warm conditions from her years teaching in poorly ventilated classrooms. She had a bandaged cut on her right hand from pruning roses the day before, but the injury seemed minor, and she paid little attention to changing gloves or thoroughly re-washing her hands while mixing the ingredients. Patricia left the potato salad on her counter for 4 hours while she showered, got dressed, and wrapped a birthday gift for her grandson, never thinking about the temperature or the bacteria multiplying in the warm potato mixture. The potluck began at noon with Patricia setting her dish on the buffet table alongside 40 other homemade contributions. The potato salad drawing immediate attention and compliments from neighbors who had been hoping she would bring it. The outdoor temperature had climbed to 94 degrees, and the dishes sat on folding tables under a tent that provided shade but no cooling, with only a few bags of ice in coolers nearby that were quickly melting in the heat. Patricia spent the afternoon mingling with friends, playing with neighborhood children, and enjoying the live band that had been hired for the celebration. 6 hours into the event, while Patricia was helping clean up paper plates, a sudden wave of nausea hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of a table for support. The cramping in her abdomen was unlike anything she had experienced, and within minutes she was vomiting violently in the community center bathroom. Other attendees began showing similar symptoms, but Patricia's condition was deteriorating at an alarming rate that seemed disproportionate to simple food poisoning. She tried to drive herself home, insisting she just needed to lie down, but pulled over 3 blocks away when another wave of vomiting left her too weak to continue. A passing motorist noticed Patricia slumped over her steering wheel and called 911. The paramedics arriving within 7 minutes to find her unconscious with dangerously low blood pressure and a rapid, thready pulse. The emergency room doctor recognized the symptoms as circulatory shock caused by severe staphylococcal food poisoning, a toxin-mediated illness linked to food held at unsafe temperatures. Patricia never regained consciousness, dying 18 hours later from cardiac failure caused by extreme dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, while 23 other potluck attendees recovered after mild illness that kept them home for a day or two. Health inspectors traced the outbreak to Patricia's potato salad, where staphylococcal bacteria introduced during preparation had produced dangerous levels of toxin in the warm, protein-rich mixture that had sat at dangerous temperatures for over 10 hours. The community was devastated by losing a beloved teacher and volunteer, and the tragedy prompted mandatory food safety training for all community event organizers. The community center now requires temperature logs for all potluck dishes and provides commercial refrigeration equipment, though neighbors still talk about whether anyone should have noticed the potato salad sitting out for so long. It was March 15th, 2014, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the humid 76-degree evening settled over the French Quarter as restaurants filled with tourists and conference guests finishing their dinners. Open windows carried the sound of jazz from nearby bars, while servers moved between crowded tables with trays of fresh oysters and shrimp, pulled earlier that day from the Gulf. Daniel Huang sat alone at the polished wooden bar, scanning the menu as he unwound after a long day of construction management seminars. At 56, the project manager had traveled from Houston for a 3-day conference and was enjoying one quiet evening away from a schedule of workshops and networking events. 14 months earlier, Daniel had received a kidney transplant after years on dialysis. Since the surgery, his doctors had repeatedly warned him to avoid raw shellfish because the medications protecting his new kidney also weakened his immune system. For months, Daniel had felt strong and healthy. Surrounded by diners ordering oysters without hesitation, he convinced himself that one meal would not matter. He ordered 24 raw Gulf oysters, watching them opened fresh at the counter while checking messages on his phone. The shells arrived on crushed ice, glistening under the bar lights, and he finished them slowly with a beer before paying his tab and walking back to his hotel. The following day passed without incident. Daniel attended meetings, toured construction sites, and prepared for his flight home feeling completely normal. 36 hours after the meal, while packing his suitcase, a sudden wave of nausea hit without warning. Within minutes he was vomiting violently, followed by severe diarrhea and a rising fever that left him shaking and barely able to stand. The infection spread quickly through his bloodstream, overwhelming his weakened immune system. As his blood pressure dropped, confusion set in, and he became unable to call for help. When he missed checkout and failed to answer repeated phone calls, hotel staff requested a welfare check. Paramedics forced open the door and found him barely conscious on the floor, his skin clammy, his pulse racing, and his blood pressure dangerously low. In the emergency room, doctors worked to stabilize him as tests revealed a rapidly spreading bacterial infection linked to contaminated oysters. The bacteria had entered his bloodstream and triggered septic shock. His kidneys began shutting down, including the transplanted organ that had sustained him for more than a year. Despite antibiotics, fluids, and emergency dialysis, his condition continued to deteriorate. His wife and 2 adult children arrived from Houston and remained at his bedside as his heart, lungs, and kidneys struggled to recover. Over the next several days, the infection continued to damage his organs faster than doctors could reverse it. By the 5th day in intensive care, his body was no longer responding to treatment. Daniel Huang died that evening, the transplanted kidney that had given him a second chance at life failing under the strain of a foodborne infection he had been warned to avoid. In the months that followed, his case circulated quietly among transplant specialists and infectious disease physicians as an example of how dangerous raw seafood can be for immunocompromised patients. His family later said he had understood the risks in theory, but never believed a single dinner could carry consequences so severe. It was October 21, 2017, in Burlington, Vermont, and a crisp, late October morning brought steady crowds into the downtown square for the weekly farmers market. White tents lined the brick walkways, offering late-season vegetables, fresh bread, honey, and handmade cheeses, while shoppers moved between stalls filling canvas bags with weekend groceries. Rebecca Thornton walked slowly through the market, with one hand resting against her 7-month pregnant stomach, following a craving she had been thinking about for days. At 32, the graphic designer worked from home and had been sharing every stage of her pregnancy online, from nursery plans to ultrasound photos. Her obstetrician had given her a printed list of foods to avoid, but Rebecca had focused mainly on the obvious ones: alcohol, deli meats, undercooked seafood, and felt confident she had been careful. At a small cheese stand, a local producer described his soft, creamy specialty made from milk collected that morning on his family farm and shaped in a nearby creamery. Rebecca asked if it was safe during pregnancy. The vendor assured her it was natural and freshly made, and although a small handwritten tag on the display noted that the cheese was unpasteurized, Rebecca overlooked it while listening to his recommendation. Trusting the reassurance, Rebecca bought a wedge and carried it home. Over the next several days, she added the cheese to sandwiches and salads, while finishing design projects and preparing for her upcoming baby shower. She felt well and remained busy, unaware that bacteria had already begun multiplying quietly in her bloodstream. 2 weeks later, she woke with a low fever, aching muscles, and fatigue. Assuming it was another pregnancy discomfort, she rested and drank fluids. When the fever lingered, she called her obstetrician's office and was told mild viral illnesses were common during pregnancy and usually passed on their own. Over the following days, the fever worsened. Rebecca began to notice the baby moving less often. By the second evening, panic replaced exhaustion, and she rushed to the hospital. Doctors quickly recognized the signs of listeriosis, a rare but dangerous infection during pregnancy. Antibiotics were started immediately, but ultrasound showed the infection had already crossed the placenta. The baby's heart rate slowed as inflammation spread through the womb. An emergency delivery was performed that night. The infant was born alive but critically ill, struggling to breathe as doctors worked to control the infection that had overwhelmed his tiny body. Rebecca was moved to intensive care as the bacteria continued circulating through her bloodstream, lowering her blood pressure and triggering early septic shock. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness as medication stabilized her heart and lungs. The antibiotics slowly began to work, but the infection had done too much damage to the child. The newborn died less than 24 hours after birth. Rebecca survived, but her recovery was long and painful. She remained hospitalized for more than a week while doctors monitored her organs for lingering damage. When she was finally discharged, she left without the baby clothes folded at home or the nursery she had prepared. In the months that followed, physicians documented her case as a reminder of how easily listeria can hide in foods that seem harmless, and how quickly pregnancy can turn a mild illness into a fatal one for an unborn child. Rebecca later said she had followed nearly every instruction her doctor had given her, except for one she never realized she had broken. It was April 7th, 2019, in Osaka, Japan, and a cool early spring evening drew long lines to a narrow sushi bar tucked along a lantern-lit side street near the river. Inside, steam rose from simmering broth pots, and the counter filled with travelers eager to try the city's most famous delicacy. Michael Turner took a seat near the end of the counter, studying the handwritten menu while watching chefs move with practiced precision behind the glass. At 43, the systems engineer from Seattle had arrived in Japan the previous morning for a week-long conference and had promised himself he would try fugu, the notoriously dangerous pufferfish served only by licensed chefs. He had read about the risk on travel blogs, but the warnings sounded distant and abstract, like folklore attached to a dish that thousands of people ate safely every year. The chef placed a small card beside his setting, showing the restaurant's prefectural permit and the official certificate allowing fugu preparation. Michael photographed it for his travel journal, reassured that everything was official. He ordered a tasting set that included thin slices of sashimi, arranged like white petals across a dark plate, garnished with scallions and citrus. When the dish arrived, Michael admired the presentation before lifting his chopsticks. The first slice tasted clean and faintly sweet. He ate slowly, savoring the experience he would later describe to friends back home. Around him, the bar buzzed with quiet conversation and the soft clatter of dishes. Within 10 minutes, he noticed a tingling sensation spreading across his lips. He rubbed them together, assuming the chili garnish was stronger than expected. The numbness crept to his tongue, dulling his sense of taste. When he tried to swallow the next bite, his throat felt thick and uncooperative. Michael set down his chopsticks and reached for his water. The glass slipped slightly in his hand as weakness began spreading through his fingers. His breathing slowed and grew shallow, each breath requiring conscious effort. He stood halfway from his stool before sinking back down, suddenly unable to coordinate his legs. The chef noticed him slumping forward and hurried around the counter. Michael attempted to speak but produced only a strained exhale. His face had gone pale, sweat forming along his temples as paralysis crept from his lips down his jaw and into his chest, tightening each breath. Within minutes, his eyelids fluttered and closed, his body rigid and unresponsive, while his heart continued beating. Inside, his mind remained clear. Michael could hear voices gathering around him and felt hands lifting his shoulders, but he could not open his eyes, move his fingers, or signal that he was still awake as paralysis locked his body in place. Emergency services were called immediately. Patrons were ushered back as staff tried to keep him upright, but his chest barely rose. By the time paramedics arrived, Michael had stopped breathing altogether. Oxygen and assisted ventilation were started on the floor beside the counter, but the toxin had already shut down the nerves controlling his diaphragm. His pulse slowed, then faded. Despite continued resuscitation efforts in the ambulance, Michael was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital, less than 40 minutes after he had taken his first bite. Doctors later explained that tetrodotoxin, the natural poison found in pufferfish organs, had entered his bloodstream and paralyzed his respiratory muscles before treatment could reverse the damage. Even trace contamination during preparation was enough to overwhelm the body within minutes. The restaurant closed quietly the following day. Michael's family learned of his death through a late-night phone call from the American consulate, stunned that a single meal could end a life so suddenly. It was June 30th, 2013, and the warm 81-degree evening in Boston, Massachusetts, created perfect conditions for what would become a tragic celebration dinner. The upscale Italian restaurant was filling with couples and families, the aroma of garlic and fresh herbs drifting from the open kitchen while servers lit candles at white-clothed tables. Tamara Johnson arrived with her fiancé, excited to celebrate their recent engagement at a restaurant that had received excellent reviews. At 28, the elementary school art teacher had been living with a severe tree nut allergy since childhood and had developed meticulous habits around checking ingredients when dining out. She carried 2 EpiPens at all times and never hesitated to inform restaurant staff about her life-threatening allergy, though she sometimes wondered if servers found her caution excessive. When their waiter arrived to take their order, Tamara clearly explained her tree nut allergy and emphasized its severity, asking detailed questions about the ingredients in the mushroom risotto she wanted to order. The waiter assured her the dish was completely nut-free and marked her order as an allergy alert, promising to speak directly with the chef about her requirements. The restaurant was understaffed that evening due to 2 cooks calling in sick, leaving the head chef managing multiple stations and relying on recently hired kitchen staff to keep up with the dinner rush. Tamara felt safe eating at the well-reviewed establishment and relaxed into the celebration, discussing wedding plans and honeymoon destinations while waiting for their meals. The risotto arrived beautifully plated with fresh herbs garnishing the creamy rice, and Tamara took her first bite while admiring the flavors and texture that justified the restaurant's reputation. By her third bite, she felt the unmistakable sensation of her throat beginning to tighten and her lips swelling rapidly, symptoms she had experienced only once before as a child. She immediately grabbed her EpiPen from her purse and injected it into her thigh while telling her fiancé to call 911, her voice already becoming hoarse as her airway began closing. The reaction was progressing unusually fast, more severe than anything she had experienced before. And although the first injection briefly slowed the swelling, her breathing continued to worsen. The restaurant manager rushed over in panic and revealed that they had recently changed their risotto recipe to include walnut-infused oil, a cost-cutting substitution that had not been communicated to the serving staff or updated on the menu. Tamara's fiancé pulled her second EpiPen from her purse and administered it, but her airway continued swelling, and her breathing became shallow and erratic. She lost consciousness moments before paramedics arrived, and her heart stopped shortly after they began emergency treatment. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes and immediately began advanced resuscitation, but her heart had gone too long without oxygen before her airway could be secured. She died at the hospital despite 40 minutes of aggressive resuscitation efforts. Her fiancé left devastated and in shock, unable to comprehend how a celebration dinner had turned into the worst night of his life. In the days that followed, doctors explained to her family that the reaction had been triggered by trace amounts of walnut oil that had never been listed on the menu. Her fiancé later said she had done everything she was taught to do to protect herself, but even careful preparation could not undo a single hidden ingredient. It was October 22, 2016, in Olympic National Forest, Washington, as a crisp autumn morning and recent rainfall fueled mushroom growth, setting the stage for a fatal foraging expedition ahead. David Kowalski adjusted his backpack straps while consulting his mushroom identification guidebook, preparing for what he hoped would be his most successful foraging trip yet. At 41, the software engineer had taken up wild mushroom hunting 3 months earlier, after reading several popular guidebooks and joining an online foraging community with over 2,000 members who shared photos and identification tips. David worked from home and spent his weekends exploring the Pacific Northwest forests, documenting his finds on social media, and gradually building confidence in his ability to identify edible species. His wife had stayed home that weekend to study for her real estate license exam, and David was enjoying the solitude of the forest as he hiked deeper into a remote section he had never explored before. Around midday, he discovered a cluster of mushrooms growing under a grove of pine trees, their appearance matching what he believed were valuable matsutake mushrooms that sold for premium prices at Seattle farmers markets. David photographed the mushrooms from multiple angles and posted them to his online foraging group with a caption asking for confirmation, though he was already fairly certain of his identification based on the guidebook descriptions. Without waiting for responses from more experienced foragers, David harvested over 2 pounds of the mushrooms and headed back to his car, already planning the butter and garlic sauté he would prepare for dinner. His phone had limited reception in the forest, and he didn't check the messages from several group members warning him not to consume the mushrooms until an expert could verify the identification. By the time David arrived home and prepared his meal, cooking the mushrooms exactly 8 minutes as his guidebook recommended for matsutake, those warning messages had been buried under dozens of other posts. 8 hours after eating the mushrooms, David woke at 3 a.m. with severe cramping and vomiting that he initially attributed to a stomach flu that had been going around his office. By morning, the symptoms had intensified, and he noticed his urine had turned dark and his body was beginning to swell, signs that concerned him enough to drive to an urgent care clinic. The doctor treated him for gastroenteritis with anti-nausea medication and instructions to stay hydrated, sending him home without recognizing that a slow-acting mushroom toxin was already causing catastrophic damage to his kidneys. Within 24 hours, David's condition had deteriorated so dramatically that his wife called 911 after finding him confused and barely responsive. The emergency room conducted toxicology screening that confirmed he had consumed Amanita smithiana, a highly toxic mushroom commonly mistaken for matsutake in Pacific Northwest forests, which he had fatally misidentified due to its resemblance to edible varieties. His kidneys were failing completely, and despite emergency dialysis, doctors could only provide supportive care while hoping the damage could be reversed. David died 4 days later from acute renal failure, his online foraging group devastated by the tragedy and haunted by their messages that had come too late to save him. Mushroom experts noted that Amanita smithiana was well established in that section of forest, where it commonly grows near pine and fir and is often confused with edible matsutake. His story became required reading in foraging communities across the Pacific Northwest, and the online group implemented strict new rules requiring expert verification before anyone consumed wild mushrooms they had identified. Thanks for watching. Click the next video to see more stories like these.